The Georgetown morning unveiled itself in layers of autumn gold, sunlight filtering through maple leaves that lined the historic streets. Denzel Washington sat in the back of his black SUV, reviewing notes for his upcoming speech at his former high school. The familiar architecture of red brick buildings and cobblestone sidewalks stirred memories of his younger days, when these same streets had shaped his aspirations. Through the tinted windows, the scene outside played out like a familiar script he'd seen too many times before. Dr. James Wilson's silver Toyota Camry was pulled over near the corner of Wisconsin Avenue, its hazard lights blinking steadily against the morning shadows. The vehicle, modest and well-maintained like its owner, seemed to shrink under the looming presence of the police cruiser parked behind it. Officer Blake Thompson's stance telegraphed authority as he stood by the driver's window, his body language a study in practiced intimidation. Even from a distance, the tension in his shoulders was visible, his hand resting deliberately on his belt as he spoke down to the vehicle's occupant. The morning commuters hurried past, their faces masks of practiced indifference, though some slowed their pace, phones partially raised in anticipated documentation. "Your registration expired last month, sir." Officer Thompson's voice carried across the quiet street, each word weighted with unnecessary emphasis. "And you failed to signal your turn back there." "Officer, I assure you my registration is current." Dr. Wilson's response emerged with the measured patience of a man who had navigated such waters before. His voice, still carrying that distinctive timbre that had commanded attention in countless classrooms, triggered a flood of memories for Denzel. The actor's mind flashed back to room 237, where a younger Dr. Wilson had stood before a classroom of restless teenagers, bringing Shakespeare's words to life with the same dignity he now displayed. "Your voice is your instrument," he'd told them, "but your character is your symphony." The lesson had shaped Denzel's approach to both acting and life. In the present, Officer Thompson's tone sharpened. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Dr. Wilson's response was calm but firm. "May I ask why that's necessary?" "Officer, I'm happy to provide my documentation." "Sir, I gave you an order." Thompson's hand shifted, his stance widening slightly. "Exit the vehicle now." Through the SUV's window, Denzel observed his former teacher's reflection in the side mirror. The same proud posture, now lined with age but undiminished in dignity. Dr. Wilson's hands remained visible on the steering wheel, his movements deliberate and measured as he tried to maintain control of the situation. The growing crowd of onlookers had begun to recognize the brewing confrontation. Phones emerged more openly now, their cameras capturing the scene from various angles. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, creating an almost theatrical staging of power and vulnerability. Denzel felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. His driver, Marcus, turned slightly in his seat. "Sir, we're running close to schedule for the school." But time had taken on a different quality now. In his decades of acting, Denzel had learned to read scenes, both scripted and real, and this one was moving toward an outcome he couldn't ignore. The parallels were too stark. Here was the man who had taught him about voice, character, and dignity, being stripped of his right to all three. Dr. Wilson was now carefully gathering his documents, his movements slow and telegraphed. "Officer, I have my current registration right here." "I said step out of the vehicle." Thompson's voice cracked through the morning air like a whip, causing several bystanders to flinch. In that moment, Denzel saw his teacher's shoulders tense, a brief flash of fear crossing his face before being replaced by that familiar mask of composed dignity. It was the same expression he'd worn years ago when facing down budget cuts, when fighting for his students' opportunities, when refusing to let circumstance diminish his commitment to education. The actor's hand found the door handle. This scene needed a rewrite. "Sir?" Marcus questioned again, concern evident in his voice. "Some scripts need revision, Marcus," Denzel replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had become his trademark. "And some moments demand we step onto a different stage." As he opened the car door, the morning air carried the mixed scents of fallen leaves and car exhaust. The crowd's murmurs shifted, recognition rippling through the gathered observers. Phones swiveled to track his movement as he stepped onto the sidewalk, straightening his jacket with the deliberate timing of a man who understood the power of an entrance. This wasn't about creating a scene, it was about preventing one. As he moved toward the confrontation, Denzel carried with him not just his celebrity, but the weight of lessons learned in room 237, lessons about voice, dignity, and the responsibility that came with both. Denzel's approach toward the scene carried the measured confidence of countless on-screen confrontations, though this performance demanded a different kind of authenticity. His footsteps on the Georgetown sidewalk echoed with deliberate purpose, each step calibrated to project authority without aggression. The morning traffic had slowed to a crawl as drivers caught glimpses of the unfolding drama. The air hummed with the low murmur of spectators and the subtle electronic chirps of recording devices. Officer Thompson's attention remained fixed on Dr. Wilson, unaware of the shifting dynamic behind him. "Good morning, officer." Denzel's voice rolled across the scene with the familiar gravitas that had commanded attention in theaters worldwide. "Is there a problem here?" Thompson's head snapped around, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, recognition, and an attempt to regain composure. His hand, which had been resting tensely on his belt, dropped to his side. "Sir, this is a police matter. I'll have to ask you to step back." "Of course." Denzel nodded, maintaining a careful distance but not retreating. "I respect your authority here, Officer Thompson." His eyes flicked to the name badge before returning to meet the officer's gaze. "But I also respect Dr. Wilson. He was my teacher, you see. Taught me about more than just literature. Taught me about dignity, about carrying yourself with grace under pressure." The crowd had grown, their phones capturing every word, every gesture. But Denzel's focus remained on creating a bridge between the two men, his presence offering a path toward de-escalation. Dr. Wilson remained in his car, his hands still visible on the steering wheel, though his posture had softened slightly. Through the window, the relief in his eyes was tempered by professional restraint, the same look he'd worn when helping students navigate difficult passages of text or complex life decisions. "Mr. Washington," Thompson's voice carried a newfound uncertainty, the earlier aggression giving way to awareness of the growing audience. "I'm conducting a routine traffic stop. The subject's registration is current," Denzel finished smoothly, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. "And I'm sure Dr. Wilson was about to show you that documentation before things escalated. Sometimes, Officer Thompson, a moment of patience can prevent a lifetime of regret." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A few onlookers nodded, their phones still recording but their expressions shifting from anticipation of conflict to appreciation of potential resolution. Thompson's supervisor, Captain Sarah Martinez, arrived minutes later, her unmarked car pulling up quietly behind the patrol vehicle. Her approach was professional, her assessment of the scene immediate and comprehensive. "Officer Thompson," she called, her voice carrying authority without theatrics. "Status report." The dynamic shifted again as Thompson turned to his superior, his report becoming increasingly uncertain as he attempted to justify the escalation of a routine traffic stop. Captain Martinez's expression remained neutral, but her eyes tracked between the gathered crowd, the distinguished professor in his car, and the internationally renowned actor whose presence had transformed a potential incident into a teachable moment. "Dr. Wilson," she addressed him directly, "would you mind showing me your registration?" The professor retrieved his documents with the same careful movements he'd displayed earlier. The papers, as Denzel had predicted, were current and in order. "Thank you for your cooperation," Martinez stated, her words carrying the weight of official acknowledgement. She turned to Officer Thompson, her voice low but clear. "We'll discuss this back at the station." As the tension began to dissipate, Denzel moved closer to Dr. Wilson's window. "Been a long time, Teach, though I wish we were meeting again under different circumstances." Dr. Wilson's smile carried decades of wisdom and weary recognition. "Life has a way of turning every moment into a lesson, doesn't it, Denzel? Even after all these years." The morning sun had risen higher, softening the shadows on the street. Onlookers began to disperse, though their recorded footage would soon tell this story across social media platforms and news outlets. But for now, two men who had last seen each other in a classroom decades ago prepared to have a different kind of conversation about power, respect, and the long arc of change. The interior of the Bean Counter Cafe offered a quiet sanctuary from the morning's events. Sunlight filtered through large windows, casting warm patterns across the worn wooden tables where Denzel and Dr. Wilson sat, 2 cups of coffee creating a fragrant barrier between present tension and past memories. Dr. Wilson's hands, still showing a slight tremor from the morning's confrontation, wrapped around his mug. At 72, he carried his years with the same dignity that had commanded respect in the classroom, though time had etched deeper lines around his eyes, and silver had long since replaced the black in his hair. You didn't have to do that, he began, his educator's voice softened by emotion. But I appreciate that you did. Denzel leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. You know, I've played cops and criminals, lawyers and gangsters, heroes and villains. But the role that matters most is the one we play in real life, being there when it counts. A young barista approached their table, recognition flickering across her face before professionalism took over. She refilled their cups with practiced efficiency, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured. My grandmother, she said suddenly, then caught herself. I'm sorry, but my grandmother was one of your students too, Dr. Wilson. Class of '82. She still talks about your Shakespeare unit. Wilson's face brightened with genuine interest. What's your grandmother's name? Maria Suarez. She said you helped her get into Georgetown when everyone else said her English wasn't good enough. Maria. Recognition lit his features. She wrote a brilliant paper comparing Macbeth to magical realism in Latin American literature. How is she? The brief exchange painted decades of impact in miniature. Countless lives touched. Directions altered. Potentials realized. The barista left their table with a warm smile, and Denzel watched his former teacher's expression shift back to contemplation. It never really changes, does it? Wilson sighed, his coffee untouched. 45 years of teaching, published works, community service, and in one moment you're still just a threat? Denzel finished. That's why I had to stop, because I remembered what you taught us about voice. Not just how to use it, but when to raise it, when to let it carry the weight of truth. Outside the cafe's windows, Georgetown continued its morning routine. Students hurried to classes, tourists consulted maps, and business people rushed between meetings. Life moved forward, unaware that just blocks away, a scene had played out that embodied both society's persistent challenges and its potential for change. Captain Martinez entered the cafe, her presence both official and tentative. She approached their table with measured steps, her badge catching the morning light. Dr. Wilson, Mr. Washington, she addressed them both with professional courtesy. I wanted to follow up personally about this morning's incident. Roosevelt High School's auditorium buzzed with the contained energy of 800 students, their expectations shaped by social media clips already circulating of the morning's events. Sunlight streamed through high windows, creating spotlight-like beams that cut through the air, thick with anticipation and the remnants of morning announcements. Principal Diana Chen stood at the podium, her professional demeanor masking her own excitement as she addressed the assembly. Today's speaker needs little introduction, but his connection to Roosevelt High goes beyond his remarkable career. He once sat where you sit now, walked these same halls, and learned from some of the same educators who continue to shape young minds today. In the wings, Denzel adjusted his tie, a gesture more meditative than necessary. Beside him, Dr. Wilson stood quietly, his earlier tremors replaced by the steady presence that had commanded classrooms for nearly half a century. The morning's confrontation had evolved into something neither man had anticipated, an opportunity to transform a moment of potential tragedy into one of transcendent teaching. Your hands aren't shaking anymore, Teach, Denzel observed quietly. Wilson's smile carried the weight of years. When you've stood before thousands of students over decades, you learn that every moment of crisis carries the seed of a lesson. Even this morning, perhaps especially this morning, the principal's voice rose with practiced enthusiasm. Please welcome back to Roosevelt High, Academy Award winner and class of '73 graduate Denzel Washington. The applause thundered through the auditorium as Denzel stepped into the light. He approached the podium with measured steps, taking in the sea of faces, diverse, expectant, each carrying their own stories of triumph and challenge. His planned speech lay folded in his jacket pocket, untouched. Good morning, he began, his voice filling the space with natural authority. I had a whole different speech prepared for today. Was going to talk about success, perseverance, the usual landmarks on the road to achievement. But something happened this morning that made me realize we need to have a different conversation. The ambient rustling of the audience settled into complete silence. Most of you have probably seen the videos already. Social media moves faster than wisdom sometimes. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. But what those clips show isn't just a confrontation. It's not just about conflict or authority or even justice. It's about something that was taught to me right here in this school, in room 237, by a man who showed me that our voice is more than just the words we speak. He turned toward the wings. Dr. James Wilson, would you join me, please? The elderly teacher's entrance sparked another wave of applause. this one building slowly as students recognized him from the viral videos. He moved with dignity to stand beside his former student. The morning's vulnerability transformed into quiet strength. Dr. Wilson taught me Shakespeare, Denzel continued. But more importantly, he taught me about dignity, about how to stand your ground without losing your grace, about how to face pressure without sacrificing your principles. In the third row, a phone caught the light as it recorded. Rather than request its removal, Denzel addressed it directly. You're recording this because you understand something important, that moments like these need to be remembered, shared, discussed. But remember this too. Every clip you share, every post you make, every story you tell becomes part of a larger narrative. Make sure it's one that adds light, not just heat. The auditorium doors opened quietly as Captain Martinez entered, accompanied by Officer Thompson. They stood at the back, their presence creating a subtle ripple of recognition through the crowd. Thompson's posture carried the stiffness of discomfort, but his presence spoke to choices made after the morning's confrontation. Leadership isn't just about authority, Denzel continued, gesturing toward the back of the room. Sometimes it's about having the courage to acknowledge our mistakes, to face the consequences of our actions, and to learn from moments that challenge our assumptions. Dr. Wilson stepped to the microphone, his educator's instincts taking over. Every day in my classroom, I tried to teach that literature isn't just about stories. It's about understanding the human experience, about recognizing that every person carries their own narrative, their own struggles, their own dignity. The morning light had shifted, the spotlight beams now illuminating different sections of the audience. Phones had largely lowered, their users caught up in the moment rather than its documentation. We're going to do something different today, Denzel announced. Instead of me telling you about success, we're going to have a real conversation about dignity, about respect, about the kind of courage it takes to maintain your humanity in challenging moments. And we're going to start by listening to each other. He gestured to Officer Thompson and Captain Martinez. Would you join us up here? Because this story isn't complete without all its voices. As they made their way to the stage, the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted from spectacle to significance. 800 students witnessed something rarer than celebrity. They saw the possibility of genuine transformation, of conflict giving way to conversation, of moments of tension becoming opportunities for growth. The morning's viral incident had captured attention, but this moment, unscripted, authentic, charged with potential, would leave the deeper mark. In room 237, decades ago, a teacher had taught about voice and dignity. Now, in the same building, those lessons echoed forward, proving that education's greatest power lies not in avoiding difficult moments, but in transforming them into opportunities for collective growth and understanding. Principal Chen watched from the side, her phone forgotten in her pocket, as 4 individuals from different walks of life demonstrated what no textbook could fully teach: the real-world application of dignity, courage, and the constant possibility of positive change. The bell would ring eventually, sending students back to their regular classes. But this assembly, born from confrontation and culminating in conversation, would continue to resonate through social media, dinner table discussions, and the ongoing dialogue about respect, authority, and the power of education to bridge the gaps between us.